Hello, my name is Mr. Lawrence Dawkins-Hall and I'm here today as a representative of the Royal Society of Biology in order to continue with a series of vignettes which describe the benefits of obtaining and finally retaining the vocational award of Chartered Biologist, denoted by the post-nominal CBiol. Today I'm going to focus on the so-called competencies, which in effect are the mainstay of your application. So this is vignette number 3, okay? And at the outset, let me state that competencies are codified knowledge, skills and behaviour which exemplify different aspects of practice that you bring to the workplace. So the Chartered Biologist Vocational Award isn't just about technical knowledge and theory and the application thereof. It's about other types of skills that we all bring to the workplace, such as planning, organisation, communication, and adherence to internal and external regulations. And it's in this sense that Chartered Biologist, through your competency expositions, and I'll break down those competencies one by one in a minute, looks at you holistically. So in essence, Chartered Biologist is not an academic award. It's a vocational award which looks at all aspects of practice codified through competencies that I'll actually enunciate and clarify as we go through this particular vignette. This vignette is number 3 of 5. The collective cachet of vignettes will be made available by the Royal Society of Biology through the My Learning portal. And thus far, in vignettes 1 and 2 respectively, what we've looked at is who is eligible to apply, and in number 2, why apply? What are the benefits of becoming a Chartered Biologist over and above your full membership of the Royal Society of Biology, so-called MRSB, which is a prelude or springboard to application resulting in your postnominals. Let me further say that everything that I'm talking about, including today, in these 5 vignettes is really covered as well in this pro forma guideline for applicants, okay? So if you scan this QR code, you will actually get a guide, which is actually quite a nice complement to what I'm going to be talking about today and what I'm talking about in the other 4 vignettes as well. But perhaps at the outset, before I dive into the competencies themselves, which exemplify different working skills, let's just do a quick recap as to what you need to become a Chartered Biologist. So a Chartered Biologist is someone who, as a minimum, as a prerequisite, is either MRSB or FRSB. To become MRSB, somebody might be in possession of a level 7 formal masters plus 3+ years experience, and having become an MRSB, to then become a Chartered Biologist, you need to gain a further 2 years with that masters in order to qualify for your postnominals. In other words, the minimum spec for a Chartered Biologist is somebody with 5+ years practice in a postgraduate environment at level 7, and moreover, as part of that working practice, has experienced or is discharging management duties in order to competently and with confidence answer the more managerial competencies that I'm going to clarify in a while. Alternatively, if you're not in possession of a level 7 formal masters, there is a route called equivalency, okay? And this in effect has a bearing on becoming an MRSB. So by way of example, if you are a level 6 graduate, have a bachelor's rather than a master's, then With equivalency, and that involves an additional report plus perhaps 6 to 8 years practicing at level 7, and that's the key. It's about practice, and it's that practice which underpins your working scenarios that you use in your competencies. That will result initially in MRSB, and then, like somebody in possession of a master's, you then go on to practice a further 2 years at level 7 as an MRSB in order to become a chartered biologist. And this is really just to emphasize the fact that regardless of the particular configuration of your career, you really need, through your competencies, to evidence the different things asked for. And as I say, as part of your 5 to 8 years without and with equivalency respectively, some of that will involve managerial duties in order to answer specific managerial supervisory competency mission statements, as we'll outline in a minute. The other thing I should say before I take a deep dive into the competencies is this is an award, as I've said before, that applies to a plethora of biosciences disciplines. Indeed, anybody practicing in a biosciences discipline, be that ecologist, field biologist, or immunologist in a lab, okay? And so those competencies are therefore necessarily generic. The first competency is knowledge and skills. And essentially, this is about applying knowledge and skills to effectively discharge your role with impact, leading to personal improvements and professional improvements. And the idea of impact is that you can demonstrate through your competency statements that what you're doing carries weight. And that impact isn't just necessarily about your own personal endeavours. It may be what you do and how it improves the working situation of others, perhaps in a team that you help run. So competency A, knowledge and skills, is further subdivided into 3 subcompetencies which constitute or can constitute a narrative. So A1, for example, it asks you to explain how your skills and knowledge in a biological science setting inform and impact on your work and, moreover, career development. Examples could include, but are not limited to, writing and presenting internal papers, writing primary journal articles, taking on volunteering roles with charities. So these 3 pictograms just illustrate writing for the biologist. Number 2 is somebody who is practicing in the field, and they, in their application, have talked about training up materials for novices, training up novices in order to practice, let's say, in an outside conservation role. It can also include, for example, critiquing a paper. Perhaps you're a member of a journal club and you're using your skills, knowledge and skills, in order to actually assess a paper. And that can be part of a journal club. It may be in a formal assessor role. A2 is about showing how you continue to develop your interest in biological sciences and what effect this has on your work. So examples could include, but are not limited to, reading biosciences journals, attending conferences, writing for biosciences publication. So the first thing to note is that you can see that in fact you can have one particular theme and you can actually transpose that into different competencies. There aren't sort of de novo specific right and wrong answers for competencies. It's whatever in terms of your own level 7 working practices fits these competency mission statements. And it may be that you take the same example and you contextualize it in the context of either different competencies or sub-competencies thereof. So there again, the examples that are sort of illustrated in the pictogram are reading articles, training novices in the field, or it could be using your skills to present at conference and convey what you know. So that is about your knowledge and understanding of your own field. It's also about your presentation skills, including, for example, preparing either a talk in PowerPoint or perhaps a poster presentation at a conference using Adobe. Knowledge and skills competency, or should I say subcompetency A3, is about demonstrating how you use critical thinking and problem solving to draw conclusions from scientific and other data as you develop courses of action. Solving problems in everyday needs. Assessors are looking in particular for examples where you have to decide on a way forward using your research skills based on the available information, and examples include but are not limited to engaging in experimental design and testing, reviewing relevant literature, databases, manuals or designs, or statistical analysis of data. So by way of its example, you may, for example, analyze your data and improve upon that analysis. So that might involve deploying, let's say, R to script the analysis, or it may be something like using a new statistical package, or perhaps an alternative package like GraphPad, which generates your data. So this is about how you interpret data and how you improve upon that data. An improvement can mean scripting and throughput, as I've just talked about there. So competency B is professional approach. So this is how you operate in your role effectively and autonomously in a team, and affected improvement and changes in both contexts with due regard to resources, the welfare of other members of your team, and also how you're accountable. So by way of example, in terms of subcompetency B1, show how you operate in your role as a biologist with autonomy, accountability and integrity. So it says, for example, you should use examples when you have been given responsibility in a relevant task and where you're able to show success in delivering the task to high ethical and professional standards. This is about demonstrating that others have trust in your action, whether it's part of a salaried role or as an outside volunteer. So your answers should demonstrate through your examples you are able to undertake projects without day-to-day supervision, give evidence that you're held accountable for your work through being given responsibility for it, show how you exhibit both professional and ethical integrity through your work, including a reflection review on your personal contributions. So this may be, for example, mentoring an apprentice. In terms of outside field work, let's say, it's about writing reports for stakeholders, okay, simplifying the language, and also writing those reports in order to account for what you do to vested parties. It could be an equipment assay, improving a particular assay in terms of how that assay is conducted, and feeding that back to either managers or to your project groups in, let's say, a seminar. B2 is describing how you reflect on possible improvements in areas of responsibility and offer to make suggestions in order to procure those improvements. So in this section, you should demonstrate that you actively review your areas of responsibility in all aspects of your professional and personal life. So examples could include encouraging the continuous development of junior staff through improvements to process the organisation, evaluation of the performance of specialist methods and tools, development of recommendations, description of examples where your actions have led to performance improvement by yourself or in the context of others, identification of lessons learned from aforementioned activities. So, for example, by way of example, that could be method evaluation through pilots. It may be that somebody is adapting a method for the field or for high throughput practice in a lab. And it could be that you need to carry out a series of small pilots to evaluate the optimal method before actually transposing that into the field or actually ranking it up in terms of high throughput in a lab, let's say in a drug discovery project. Another could be survey methodology, field survey methodology and recording data improvements, okay? Something that you've done to actually improve how you or volunteers under your jurisdiction compile data in a conservation project, let's say in the field. B3 is about giving examples of working as part of a successful team, highlighting your particular contribution to that team and the aforementioned success. So teamwork is different from working in a group. In a team, there are a range of roles which all need to work successfully together. While teamwork examples are easy to give for organisations, for education in schools and colleges, and in any place where several skills are needed to deliver a project, your answer should demonstrate through examples such as how you directly contributed to the work of a successful team and the outcome of that work, how you manage the merger or integration of different teams, how you manage working relationships across different departments or organisations, any interactions with committees, working groups or other professional or voluntary body activities. So that might be, for example, if you're in a lab making improvements, okay, in terms of stock taking and ordering and how others actually access the materials within that lab. It could be if you're a teaching technician that you're making improvements with regard, let's say, to school timetables. Or it may be that if you're a team leader working within a university setting as a technical team leader, it could be that you're interacting with estates and services, facilities and estates, in order to actually procure structural improvements within your lab or indeed a series of labs across your department. B4 is about showing how you plan work and demonstrate foresight in carrying out your responsibilities using resources effectively. So this is about scoping and planning projects, okay? Examples could include, but are not limited to, identifying resources, which may be money, but resources are also, let's say, time and people needed to undertake the activities, monitoring and surveillance of the progress of those activities, identifying, evaluating and implementing changes that may be needed to ensure the activities are successfully completed, identifying management of risks that could impact on the successful completion of those activities. And that might be, for example, when you're scoping and planning a project as an ecologist, as the lead person in the field. How many volunteers are needed? Okay, what will be the method of training? what are the sort of time constraints, and what are the outputs from that project that you will then summarize for stakeholders. In a lab, it could be something like using cheaper, quicker and better materials in the context of a standard operating procedure, or in fact, as a more senior biomedical scientist in a lab, how you introduce more updated technology in order to basically improve the way data is collected, and the implications in terms of health and safety for installation, training, how many people need to be trained, how long will that take, evaluating pilot methods in-house. So it's about scoping and planning projects. In B5, you explain how you exert your influence in your role and demonstrate good leadership either directly or via networks. So the assessors are looking for examples of you successfully leading initiatives or triggering new activity by convincing others of the need for change. Examples could include, but are not limited to, experience of mentoring or coaching, considering when you have managed change within your organization or overseen the implementation of a new process. So that really builds on what I've said above in terms, let's say, of not just using better materials, whether that's cheaper or quicker for a standard operating procedure, but actually to introduce more fundamental or better methods in terms of equipment and how you actually go about installing that equipment, training yourself, training others, and actually working up methods that are then used within your group. It could be mentoring, personal mentoring, student mentoring. It may be providing Royal Society of Biology workshops. C is about communication and collaboration. Communication working with specialist and non-specialist audiences alike, and how you manage those relationships effectively. So the two sort of seminal terms in that statement are specialist and non-specialist, okay? So a specialist communication is technical training of others. Non-specialist is really alluding to more managerial responsibilities where, for example, you're dealing with finance. If, for example, you're responsible for a consumables budget, perhaps for scoping and managing projects, as we've already discussed. It can also mean dealing with volunteers in the field and how you train those up, okay? How you communicate, how you train up somebody in technical language, but who may not be a specialist like yourself. So these are two examples I've given. Outreach and education, okay? So it's how you communicate effectively with people that do not share your own specialist knowledge. So it could be, for example, talking about what you do to administrative people or A-level students in your lab. So it's specialist communication, but pitching that communication using metaphors and analogies in such a way that someone that doesn't have postgraduate degree level knowledge can essentially assimilate what it is you do in the lab. Another example of specialist communication with challenges might be international students, okay? So international students are specialists, but if English is not their first language, then you need to find modes of communication that actually suit their understanding better. So it may be that their spoken English, for example, is not that good, but their written English is. So you communicate having trained them by backing up what you say with detailed explanations. It could be that you use pictograms, okay, to illustrate what you're doing during training, because as the maxim goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that will facilitate specialist communication, but with someone whose first language is not English. Non-specialist communication, as I say, is about communicating with estates and services, finances, or somebody where you're communicating outside the remit of technical knowledge. It could even be somebody like an engineer who is responsible for maintaining an analytical platform that you use in your job. You communicate with that person about the science, but you communicate in such a way that you just focus on the instrument. And it's non-specialist in the sense that whilst that person is probably STEM, they don't have your specialist knowledge, perhaps inculcated through a specific degree. So C2 is discussing, show how you discuss work constructively and objectively with colleagues, customers and others, and how you respond respectfully to and acknowledge alternative views or alternative ways of thinking. So that may be dealing with student mental health problems, okay. That really underpins good student paternal care. It may be that as part and parcel of lab organisation, that there are organisational improvements and that there are people within the group who aren't actually practicing as they should. And it's about essentially taking them aside and listening to their point of view and understanding why it is that perhaps they're not pulling their weight in terms of the coherent team. Or working in order to advise wildlife conservation groups, filed with reports, writing, generating funds, etc. D1 is about responsibility. How do you demonstrate that you carry out your role with integrity and compliance with ethical and technical standards and with due regard to the safety, welfare, sustainability and reputation of your organisation, both in the context of volunteers and say appropriate and in the way, let's say, animals are handled as one example. So in D1, explain how you promote, implement and take responsibility for health, safety and environmental issues and adhere to requirements relevant to your role. So in this section you should show your attitude to health and safety and the impact your work has. A professional approach will always consider the effect of your actions on others as well as on the environment. Your answers should demonstrate you thorough understanding and appreciation for the policies and protocols related to health, safety and environmental issues that apply to the work, be that paid or voluntary. You might want to include examples where you have implemented and promoted, for example, these protocols, and describe any responsibilities that you have related this to. Demonstrate that you know where these policies and protocols are documented. How does your work contribute to the update and development of your workplace policies and procedures? How do you promote the awareness and application of these policies and protocols with others, especially peers and more junior colleagues? So this could be, for example, related to health and safety. Are you responsible, for example, for implementing COSH? Do you train others in COSH or within a school setting as a bioscientist, CLEAPS, okay? Do you not just train people in how to, let's say, complete COSH forms or go through COSH forms as a supervisor in terms of making sure they know how to practice in a safety compliant way? Are you responsible for actually writing those COSH forms? Are you responsible for promoting their reading by volunteers in the field? So those sorts of health and safety considerations. Another one, by way of example, would be promoting safe waste disposal policies. Are you responsible for disposing of waste? And if you're responsible for the supervision of others who dispose of waste, do you write and train them in relevant policies? So another could be your use of personal protective equipment and how you encourage that in other people you're responsible for, outside volunteers or more technical junior people in the lab, perhaps through inculcation in COSH forms that we've just mentioned. Risk assessment and training of volunteers in the outside, let's say as a field biologist. Or perhaps you are responsible for equipment and safety testing and auditing, equipment that's used in order to underpin work that you do within a lab or outside. D2 refers to describing your contribution to key tasks, understanding fully the biological science objectives of the work done and its relevance to your employer and others. So, by way of example, if you deal with clinical samples, it could be about compliance with the Human Tissue Act in order to ethically source and use anonymised patient samples in your work. Do you, by way of example, train others in handling patient samples and data in research? Are you responsible for ensuring that they've actually completed relevant HTA training courses online? It could be that you are responsible for public talks, e.g. standalone talks on things like the use of genetically modified organisms, or conservation reports to local governments if you're responsible for actually carrying out and supervising volunteers in the field on a conservation project. D3 is describing how you show professional integrity and respect for confidentiality and where you comply with personal and professional issues such as ethical practice and the RSB Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct. So what assessors are looking for in your competency in this particular case, namely subcompetency D3, is for evidence that you comply with RSB codes of ethical and professional conduct, and indeed other codes of ethical and professional conduct, especially around issues of trust associated with responsibility and the need to keep confidence. So examples could include, but not by any means limited to, consideration for equality, diversity and inclusion, examples of reliability and integrity and ethical practice, examples of where you've dealt with confidential matters. So this could be student records, How do you deal with student records in an ethical way? It could be about formulating or simply adhering to, complying with mandatory equality, diversity courses, It could be there again, because answers aren't exclusive to each subcompetency. Apart from student records, it could be dealing with student issues related to, let's say, animal health, related to student health. Finally, if you're dealing with animals, if there's vivisection in your work, how do you go about discharging your responsibilities with due regard, ethical regard to animal welfare, and moreover challenges, let's say, of handling animals in the wild in particular, but also in-house in laboratories, and perhaps training that you provide for others in your charge outside or in a lab with regard to handling and use of animals in a research environment. Section E is supporting the profession, so it's demonstrating how you support biology both within and outside your working environment by participating in extracurricular activities outside of your paid workplace, and also supporting the progression of colleagues within the workplace and outside. So supporting the profession is codified into two sub-competencies. E1 is about giving examples of your contribution to the profession of biology outside your direct salaried environment. In this section, you should demonstrate proactive involvement in initiatives that support professionalization of your subject outside of your salaried job. Examples should not cover activities which are part of your employment, but however could include presenting at conferences and events, contribution of articles to scientific journals, voluntary work in the field or in schools. And examples could be if you are, let's say, performing outreach work. Maybe you're doing outreach work in schools. Maybe, as we've touched upon before, you're part of or you're leading a conservation effort in the field as an ecologist. Finally, it may be that you have extracurricular sort of responsibilities in terms of being an editor for a journal. E2, which is the final sub-competency of your Chartered Biology report, is about giving examples of how you support and develop the career of your colleagues. So in this section, you should demonstrate how you encourage others to move forward, to develop their own skills and knowledge, and hence progress in their careers. Examples could include, but are not limited to, how you have taken an active role in supporting and developing your colleagues, your work to promote careers in STEM, including the design of materials and reflection of success, and then identifying professional development needs amongst your college and your active involvement in their completion of professional development plans. So perhaps within your workplace you're involved in CPD appraisals. It may be that outside of the workplace, for example, you provide professional registration workshops. And I suppose, looking at it autobiographically, these vignettes that I'm making, which are designed to support obtaining and retaining the CBiol award, are a good example of that. Endpoint assessment as basically someone who assesses STEM apprentices, the training involved in that, and you actually performing that role, which will result in young scientists going on to gain their STEM qualification. Finally, I want to end by sort of talking a little bit, and this will be revisited much more in vignette 4, where we look at how you write your competency answers that we've just touched upon, and what assessors look for in terms of validation of those answers. Okay, so essentially, to complete this vignette, how does somebody go about writing about the sorts of materials that I've explained? Well, a good acronym is STAR: situation, task, action, result. Okay, so describe in the first paragraph what it is you want to talk about. Okay, so provide pertinency within that paragraph, which relates or transposes to the competency mission objectives that I've previously described. In paragraph 2, talk about how you select a task and implement that task, your action, in order to address the issue that you've introduced in paragraph 1. And finally, it's important that with any working scenario that you use in your competency report, that you pick an example where what you have described in paragraphs 1 and 2 is validated. In other words, there is a veritable output. So before I conclude, I would say keep your answers clear, comprehensive and concise, and that is because, as I talk about in Vignette 4, the competency report is assessed by 2 STEM scientists, but they may not share your specialist knowledge. You can use examples more than once, and by virtue of the fact that your assessors may not share your specialist knowledge, if you use acronyms, define them, and also give a sentence about what they mean. So as a way of sort of encapsulating that, if you are an analytical chemist, if you working in a sort of biological environment, and you use HPLC, state that HPLC stands for high performance liquid chromatography, and that is a technique that's used to enrich and to analyze a particular substance of interest. The final thing I'll say before I finish is that your competency answers pertaining to those working scenarios we've talked about, and also, as I'll elaborate in Vignette 4, they need to be autobiographical. In other words, within those 3 paragraphs, particularly paragraphs 2 and 3, in 1, if it is a team effort, you can introduce the sort of overall objectives of the team. But certainly in terms of paragraphs 2 and 3, where you're talking about how you tackle a problem and what the results are, you need to keep it autobiographical. What was your contribution to that particular effort? Okay, so it needs to be replete with the pronoun I and not we. Thank you.